So this is our final panel of the day. My name is Zacharias. I'm a faculty member at York University and on the board with the Journal of Mennonite Studies, and it's my pleasure to be able to moderate and enjoy our panelists with you today. The title that was given to the panel is Opening, Ruptures, and Forging Connections, Cultural Production Among the 1870s Descendants. And I think at one point in the discussions, we had thought maybe we'll do a round table where we'll just sort of banter back and forth and open into conversations. And then we decided, actually, let's do a more formal reading/presentations. And so what you're seeing on the brochure is that sort of remnants of the round table idea. However, we hope to keep some of that spirit in the conversation afterwards. So I'm going to introduce each of our four panelists now, and they'll have a seat. As we've been doing for the rest of the conference, they'll each take 15 minutes or so to present, and then we should have some good time left to have a conversation about their work. So they'll be presenting in the order that we have them in our program, and that begins with Armin Wiebe. Armin Wiebe has published 5 books of fiction set in mythical Gutenthal: The Salvation of Yash Siemens, Murder in Gutenthal, The Second Coming of Yeet Schmanst, Armin's Shorts, and Grandmother Laughing. Tatsia, set in Canada's subarctic, was awarded the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award and the Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction. His play, The Moonlight Sonata of Beethoven Blatz, premiered with Theatre Projects Manitoba in 2011. Armin's first OTA play, Wine and Little Breads, placed first in the Rhubarb Winnipeg Mennonite Theatre one-act play contest and was performed by the WMT in 2014. A full-length version received a stage reading at the Carol Shields Festival of New Works in 2018 and an honorable mention in the 2019 Herman Voden National Playwriting Competition. His second OTA play, The Recipe, will premiere at Tom Hendry Warehouse in November 2024 in a co-production between Theatre Projects Manitoba and Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre. Armin, did I see a pamphlet or some advertising for that at the back?
Yeah, there was something on the page.
Okay. Yeah, so you can pick up the details about that. It sounds wonderful. In addition to teaching in various communities in Manitoba, Armin lived and taught for 6 years in Hawaii Northwest Territories before teaching creative writing for a dozen years at Red River College. Our second presenter today will be Miriam Rudolph. Miriam was born and raised in Paraguay in a Mennonite community. In 2003, she moved to Canada to study fine arts at the University of Manitoba, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in 2007 and a Bachelor of Education in 2010. She completed a Master of Fine Arts in Printmaking at the University of Alberta in 2017. She has received numerous scholarships, awards, and grants, and was invited to work on an artist residency project with the British Museum in 2021, and was commissioned to create a series of prints for the Winnipeg Art Gallery in 2022. And that work for the British Museum about the Mennonite colonization of Paraguay was published as a smaller scale book titled Layered Histories, Perspectives on Colonization from the Chaco, which I think is available at the back as well. It's a beautiful kind of coffee table book. So Miriam has shown her work locally, nationally, and internationally, here in Canada, the US, Paraguay, Europe, and Asia. She now works and lives in Winnipeg as a professional artist, the home studio, a printing press, a big vegetable garden, and with her husband and little son. Our third presenter today will be Brandt. Di is an internationally renowned poet, author, editor, translator, playwright, teacher, and cultural events organizer. The American critic and poet Jeff Gundy has called her a leading trailblazer and influence in the development of modern Mennonite literature in North America, along with, and perhaps more so than Rudy, Wiebe. But her influence extends far beyond the Mennonite borders. Di's celebrated writing has left a permanent mark on the development of multicultural literary and cultural understandings in Canada and internationally. Her ecstatic embodied poetics has influenced the direction of both regionally inflected prairie poetics and the development of new eco-poetic engagements in the contemporary urban cosmopolitan globalized context. And Di, I think I saw a number of your books at the back here as well, if I remember correctly. So this is The World, and Here I Am in It is a collection of essays that I was particularly happy to see there. And our conference and our panel will end with Andrew Unger. Andrew is the author of the Mennonite satire website, The Unger Review, which you may know as under its former title of The Daily Bonnet. Since 2016, Andrew has written more than 3,000 satirical articles, drawing the attention of the New York Times, the New Yorker, and has been cited in a debate in the Canadian House of Commons. His debut novel, Once Removed, won the First Book Award at the 2021 Manitoba Book Awards. A collection of Daily Bonnet articles called The Best of the Bonnet was published by Turnstone Press in 2021. So I'm looking forward to each of these presentations. Please help me welcome Armin to start us off.
I tried to get Josh Siemens to be on this panel in my place. But he said, Wiebe, I gave you a testimony for you once, and people got all knappig over chapter 8, so no. But you could ask Ota. But Ota said she has a women talking support group meeting today. Some of the group saw the Naked Mennonite at the Fringe Festival and are wondering if maybe they could lure Alan Fair to perform it at the Cron Barn to help people figure out if they can love their children as they are and the church yet too. Then Ota said, besides, if people want to hear what I have to say, tell them they should come see The Recipe in November at the Warehouse Theatre. But don't tell them what the recipe is beforehand, because I don't want the Mennonite girls can cook to get their sticky fingers on it. In 1955, my father read a story to us in the Rosengart School about a family that lived in Weidenfeld who had a daughter, Sush, going to Bible school in Altona. Years later, I found out that the author was Susan Hebert, and her story was part of an anthology of Canadian stories for children. Aside from that, to my knowledge, no one had written fiction about this area between the Red River and the Pembina Hills, where pretty much everyone was a Mennonite, even the Lutherans and the Jehovah's Witnesses. The West Reserve was a place where we spoke English in school, heard German in church, and spoke Plautich everywhere else. And on the beet field, we buggered up all three languages. And I, who would never be a farmer or a minister or a PAX worker, decided one day it might be amusing to make literature out of beet field yeshvita. And so the Salvation of Josh Siemens was born, and with this cover, I didn't think readers would think it was a Danny Orlis book. This was 1984, so really, since then, West Reserve Canadian Mennonites have had less than 50 years to get used to reading about themselves in language accessible to the outside world. I sometimes get asked how people who don't know Plautich can understand my books. My flippant first response is, only Mennonites ask me that. I'll admit that at first I thought I'd have maybe 20 readers, artsy flat Germans who like red wine. But was pleasantly surprised when readers from a variety of backgrounds enjoyed the strange language, letting their imaginations go wild with possible meanings for the Plautich words. Some said they were disappointed when the words were explained to them. I wonder if maybe the question of how can non-Mennonite readers understand my writing stems from a sense of embarrassment. A Mennonite bookseller used to put language warnings beside my titles in its catalog, but not beside David Bergen's or Di Brandt's. Really, we've worked so hard to be accepted as Stephen Harper's old stock Canadians, and now some schledents who's neither dipped nor sprinkled brings up all this pressed stuff that we had long ago plowed under along with the tall grass prairie. My interest is in creating voices, not maintaining fealty to any pure mother tongue. And as with Beatfield Yeshvita, I buggered up the 3 languages and coined words that tried to convey the personality and character of the speakers and their world. I do this in service of the stories. And stories need people who exist in a place. Why invent Middle Earth when you have the West Reserve? The West Reserve is full of stories, and it hasn't been written about that much. We wannabe writers didn't have to compete with Goethe or Günter Grass or Tolstoy. In the 1950s and 60s, there seemed to be an almost conscious effort to suppress the folk culture of the Mennonites, the village practices, the bromtup, the social games, dancing, and so forth. There was confusion and tension between Mennonite as a religion and Mennonite as an ethnic culture. I dare say that if Mennonite were merely a religious denomination, there would be no Mennonite literature. U.S. influences such as Back to the Bible broadcast and tent crusades seemed to foster a curious kind of Puritanism. So we had sermons against drinking while the farmers in the pews were quietly content to receive malting grade for their barley. In 1966, well-behaved Mennonite youth pleaded with church leaders at the Mennonite Church Conference to allow them to attend the Sound of Music, since going to movies violated church policies. Now we're anticipating the movie version of Rachel Yoder's Night Bitch. But Josh summed it up when he said, "Don't forget, if you pull a flat German out of his Sunday suit, you have a mensch like everyone else." And in my Gutentag world that I imagined out of the West Reserve I grew up in, there are many Mensche, and they all have stories. In my novel, Grandmother Laughing, Sush says, "If I don't tell this, no one will ever know." On my computer desktop, I have a poem by Sean Thomas Doherty. Why bother? Because right now, there is someone out there with a wound in the exact shape of your words. At a writers' conference in 1984, a woman quietly told me that a Mennonite friend of hers had been contemplating suicide. However, after she read The Salvation of Yash Siemens, she changed her mind. Something kept me from asking after details. Surely there were stories there, but they were not for me to know. If I had sought out or assumed that I knew the shape of such wounds and then tried to write stories intended to dress those wounds, the stories would be false and unlikely to match the shape of anyone's wounds. I say unlikely because I also don't know what the reader will bring to my writing. I don't know what detail, what emotion, what image will resonate with or torment the reader. I can only write what wants to be written as well as I possibly can until I have to let it go, find its place in the world. A story is never the whole story. There is also always a possible spin-off story. My new play, The Recipe, is a spin-off from The Salvation of Yash Siemens, stemming from a slightly altered moment from the novel, which quickly sprouts into its own story. While the novel is driven by Yash's voice and point of view, the play is powered by Ota. If you haven't met Ota, I encourage you to meet this abundant woman who has lurked in my imagination for over 40 years. Ota is, with apologies to Tennyson, a part of all women that I have met. And when story triggers occur to me, she sometimes appears with a context and then hounds me until I write it. Although the play is fiction, the recipe uses a real midwife's recipe cited in a paper by Conrad Stace called For Women When Their Monthly Period is Late, Mennonite Midwives and the Control of Fertility. When I heard this paper presented in 2016, I thought, there's a story here, but I had no idea what it was until Ota bugged me. Jack Thiessen defines rupture as bruch, or hernia. The second definition is tvei, or broken in two. A third variation is plautze, or burst, with a hint of that fabled Mennonite dessert the dainty ones called plats. Over the years, I have been treated to various rumors of hernias, and I've written about some of them in my introduction to the latest edition of Yash, which now sports a modest bonnet romance-style cover. So if you want to be subversive, you can sneak it onto the shelf in your church library. I like to think that my work is as celebratory as rhubarb plots, but concede that my work is not public relations material for anything officially Mennonite. However, the only rupture regarding my work I have experienced in person happened at Station Arts Center in Rostern. The managers of the theater had made arrangements with Mennonite Church Canada Assembly being held in Saskatoon to attend the preview performance of my play, The Moonlight Sonata of Beethoven Blatz. The Assembly materials listed this entertainment option by title with the tagline, a comedy play. That I was the playwright was not mentioned. For the preview, the director had the actors deliberately play up the slapstick and physical comedy of the play with the goal of settling down into the desired rhythm and mood on opening night. So the preview audience was treated to a rather zany performance, and the audience responded in kind, and the performers responded to that. Never had I seen such a raucous audience. From beginning to end, uproarious laughter. Uproarious, not nervous. Even the sex on the piano bench scene didn't seem to give anyone pause. At the end, there was a whoosh as the whole crowd rose as one in a standing ovation such I've never seen before. The next morning, the theater had 30 emails from people asking for their money back. I so wish that the audience could have returned to experience opening night, when the performance settled into where it was meant to be, and they might have picked up on the nuances, the grief, the joy, and I think the love that's in the play. The two pastors who wrote columns about the play for Canadian Mennonite might have noticed echoes of Abraham and Sarah in my characters Obram and Sush. Both pastors conceded that they had laughed, and laughed hard, then had second thoughts about their amusement. One wrote their column almost a year later without mentioning the title of the play or the name of the playwright. One part of my ego thought, wow, my play must be pretty good if it's still on their mind after a whole year. But everything has a context. People who attended the assembly, as well as the play that evening, told me later that the assembly had experienced the day of excruciating sessions on what some have labeled loin issues. And so we're in the wrong frame of mind for the play that evening. And art isn't a one-way street. If you experience a work of art, you are entitled to, or even obligated, to react and evaluate your experience without worrying about how others experience the art, or the finger-pointing of some undefined constituency, or for that matter, the shadow of the artist's moralistic fly-swatter hovering overhead. Yet I can't unhear the uproarious laughter and the unified whoosh of the standing ovation. Thanks for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will present an artist's book project that was commissioned by the Winnipeg Art Gallery in 2022 as part of the exhibition Headlines, The Art of the News Cycle, which celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Winnipeg Free Press. My series of prints titled Storied Land, Remapping Winnipeg explores segments of the colonial and racial history of settlement in Manitoba and Winnipeg through the use of layered etchings that recall diverging narratives of experiences. My maternal great-great-great-grandparents were among the early Mennonite settlers that migrated to Manitoba between 1874 and 1877. This project gave me the opportunity to explore the colonial history of my own roots and challenge the settler narratives I grew up with. Due to time constraints for this presentation, I chose 5 of the 7 prints to touch on today. As part of my research, I accessed the archives of the Winnipeg Free Press. I visited the Mennonite Heritage Center archives, and I read articles and books by local historians and Indigenous authors that offer new and critical perspectives on many of the city's developments. I chose to work with a cross-section of themes from the past 150 years where colonization histories of the province or the city intersect in some form with Mennonite history, either in the context of Indigenous or Métis dispossession or in support of reconciliation efforts. The format of the prints and layout of the text resembles the format of newspaper pages. The inclusion of digitally printed maps, contemporary satellite imagery, and grids represent the settler practices of land surveying, mapping, organizing, privatizing, and settlement, as well as the colonial imposition of a certain kind of order, of will, of a way of life, and of a way of thinking. To set up my narratives, I pull direct quotations from news stories dating as far back as 1874 and following their chronological trajectories to recent times. My prints are copper etchings combined with digitally printed maps. I work with the imagery of lightly or deeply etched figures of men, women, and children. The size and strength of the etching of the figures reflects the power dynamics between the different groupings. In the first print, which you see here, and the last print, the layering of the figures representing Indigenous people creates darker tones, giving them a stronger presence, which is also reflected in the representation of ribbon skirts and drums, symbols of strength, pride, and self-confidence that stand for a reclaiming of identity that goes along with the reclaiming of history and of land. I am aware that the portrayal of Indigenous people by settlers can potentially be problematic, but I do hope these prints will be a point of conversation rather than a point of contention. Archives and newspapers give us access to parts of our history, evidenced in the reporting, but also in the omissions in that same reporting. I'm interested in the language and tone that is used in the reporting and how it has changed over the years, particularly in the way Indigenous and Métis people, as well as settlers, are represented. On the one hand, these representations are a reflection of the perception of racial differences in their time. On the other hand, they have played, and continue to play, a critical role in shaping public opinion. Part of my family's history has always been the migration of Mennonites from Imperial Russia, or modern-day Ukraine, to Manitoba before migrating further to Paraguay. I took my family's link to Manitoba as the starting point for my research into the settlement history of the province. The Daily Free Press reports on August 1st, 1874, quote, "The first installment of the Mennonites, consisting of 380 persons, arrived last evening by the International. The individuals composing the party seem to be composed of exactly the right sort of stuff, physically, for pioneer life, and this, taken in connection with the well-known frugal habits and thriftiness of the Germans, will ensure their prosperity here. We may congratulate ourselves upon so valuable an acquisition to our population." End quote. The praising tone continues in a speech by Governor General Lord Dufferin, printed in the Manitoba Daily Free Press 3 years later, on October 1st, 1877. Quote, "Seldom have I beheld any spectacle more pregnant with prophecy, more fraught with promise of an astonishing future than the Mennonite settlement. When I visited these interesting people, they had only been 2 years in the province, and yet in a long ride I took across the prairies, which but yesterday was absolutely bare, desolate, and untenanted, and the home of the wolf, the badger, and the eagle, I passed village after village, homestead after homestead, while on either side of the road, cornfields already ripe for harvest, and pastures populous with herds of cattle, stretched away to the horizon." End quote. The background of this print is a digitally printed map of Manitoba from 1876, where I have highlighted in red the Mennonite land reserves, known as East Reserve around the Steinbach area and West Reserve in the Winkler-Altona area. A Métis family is pushed to the margins, while large looming figures representing settler families fill the space. Several contemporary Mennonite scholars have wrestled with the settlement history, following paper trails of dispossession of Métis families in the East Reserve area, families that after 20 years of legal battles were finally granted land elsewhere. As Donovan Giesbrecht writes, quote, "The struggles of these Métis claimants challenged the notion of an unoccupied prairie settled by Mennonite immigrants who were not intruding on others." End quote. I chose a few texts with indigenous perspectives from secondary sources, such as Wabung Our Tomorrows by the Indian Tribes of Manitoba, 1971, which states, quote, "The terms of the treaties were unconscionable in that they did not ensure fair and equitable treatment to us, and must rank in history as one of the outstanding swindles of all time. The Indian people of that day could not possibly have anticipated the massive immigration of white settlers to this country." End quote. In 2004, Elijah Harper, Cree politician, writes in a speech, "What Canada Means to Me," quote, "Our forefathers had difficulty understanding the concept of owning land. It is alien, like the concept of owning air." End quote. He concludes that, quote, "There needs to be a healing of the land and the people. There needs to be reconciliation, restoration, and restitution." End quote. While not directly linked, in prints 4 and 5, I juxtapose imagery and narratives from the Métis settlement of Roostertown and the early urban Mennonite settlement in North Kildonan for comparison. It struck me how similar the living conditions and poverty appeared to have been in both communities. However, the narratives surrounding the settlements differ dramatically. While the inhabitants of Roostertown are repeatedly stigmatized and blamed for their own poverty, the Mennonite settlers are praised for their achievements despite adversity. For those of you who haven't heard of Roostertown, just briefly, it was a Métis settlement, often referred to as a shanty town on the southern fringes of Winnipeg from 1900 to about 1959, when it was demolished to make way for Grant Park Mall and school. In this print, you can see a digitally printed map of the Roostertown households in 1951 in the background. Various newspaper articles from the 1950s described the Métis of Roostertown as destitute, a sticky social problem, where the children are raised in filth and squalor. The houses are called dilapidated shacks and contrasted with the colorful, newly built houses on Corridon. The lack of cleanliness and sanitation are repeatedly mentioned. Newer research disputes the claims the newspapers perpetuated. While poor, many of the Métis residents had stable employment, and many paid property taxes even though they didn't own the land. They kept small gardens and chickens. The Métis in Roostertown faced violence and racism. They were landless since they had never received the land they'd been promised under the Manitoba Act. Despite asking for decades, they never received city services like running water, sewers, or electricity. The first urban Mennonites also lived in simple two-room houses. They also had to get water from pumps every day. The streets were muddy. I used the image of the same simple house in both prints, with the more affluent neighborhoods either encroaching or being within an easy distance. The digitally printed background in this print is a sketch map of the early Mennonite village in North Kildonan from 1930. The Mennonite settlement on the outskirts of Winnipeg started in 1928. Mennonite land agents had found this land, which was very fertile and suitable for market gardens, dairy and poultry farming, to supply the nearby city of Winnipeg. First-person accounts illustrate how poor the early settlers were. But a few years after settlement, they received amenities like electricity and running water, which helped them grow and build their homes and businesses. Local politicians like Premier Sterling Lyon extolled the virtues of the Mennonites at the 50th anniversary of the settlement. Quote, "Arriving in Winnipeg without any kind of worldly possessions, they applied hard work and thrift to their market gardens, chicken farms, and other ventures. In time, these were expanded and became thriving industries. Their contribution to the Canadian way of life has been and will continue to be of great value." End quote. While the Mennonites emerged as a thriving community, the Métis community remained impoverished and was eventually demolished. Through the narratives and these prints, I suggest that racism shaped these different developments. The last two prints focus on efforts of reconciliation and restitution in more recent years. The focus shifts from the settler's story to that of Indigenous people and their fight for justice and restitution. The Mennonite involvement in these narratives happens on the periphery of the action, but it is an important shift in thinking and acting on our colonial heritage to support new ways forward. This is Freedom Road, chronicles the construction of Winnipeg's aqueduct from explorations of Shoal Lake in 1906 to reparations made in 2015 to the Indigenous community so deeply affected by this. Among the activists that pressured the government to act were also Mennonite voices. The background of this print is a digitally printed map of the trajectory of the Shoal Lake Aqueduct from 1918. Centrally located are the houses of Winnipeg, while the Indigenous families of Shoal Lake number 40 are pushed to the margins. Their houses and homes are upended sideways along the edge of the paper. Behind the city of Winnipeg, you can see large figures representing politicians and settlers printed on the back side of the paper, representing the powerful decision makers behind the colonization projects. In the final print, the background is a map of Winnipeg's River Heights and Tuxedo neighborhoods with a white blank space of the planned new urban reserve, Navi Odena. Figures of Indigenous people fill the center. The blank space of the image while in previous prints, the figures were pushed to the margins. The blank space outlining the land of the former Kapyong barracks site symbolizes a kind of blank slate for a new beginning. It took 15 years of negotiations and legal battles until Treaty 1 First Nations signed a settlement agreement in 2019 to buy the former Kapyong barracks from the federal government. There was also some skepticism from local residents about an urban reserve coming to the neighborhood, and CMU hosted a number of panel discussions to explore what an urban reserve might look like. In the print, figures of settler families and politicians gather along the side of the new reserve, tentatively touching and overlapping with the indigenous figures to indicate new social and cultural connections. The Winnipeg houses are printed upside down, symbolizing a change in the colonial system in society. To me, Navi Odena represents a new space through which the relationships and perceptions between settlers and indigenous communities are beginning to change. What stood out to me in my research for the last two prints, where I portray beautiful and hopeful outcomes of the reconciliation process, is the arduous, lengthy, and persistent legal fight Indigenous communities have to go through to receive some form of restitution to this day. Perhaps as a community of allies grows, we can demand a future in which these battles for justice and respect won't have to be so hard fought for. When I look at the change in public perception and attitudes, a greater understanding of colonization processes and systemic racism, the change in language and representation in our local newspapers, the grappling with our own colonial histories, I'm hopeful that things will continue to change for a better and more inclusive society. If you would like to spend more time reading Storied Land Remapping Winnipeg, you can access a digital version of this artist's book on my website.
I want to remember here with you the deep-rooted, strong, centuries-old, multi-dimensional poetry practices of the Traditionalist, Darp Mennonites of southern Manitoba, still going strong when I was growing up there in the 1950s and 60s. They diminished, alas, not during the Depression, but with the arrival of television and cars and transistor radios, and were later further marginalized in the churches and Mennonite studies programs in Winnipeg in favor of more sober, earnest disciplines like history and theology and sociology. The cultural loss was immense. We, the new Manitoba Mennonite literary writers of the 1970s and 80s and beyond, worked hard to preserve some of the old quantum peasant aesthetic and spiritual sensibility held in the poetic part of our heritage, causing a split in Mennonite cultural life in Manitoba that we're just now beginning to reach across. Are we beginning to reach across? Trying to. The village I grew up in is Rhineland, nestled in the heart of the Darpa, numbering around 30 then, each with 200 or so residents, all of them interconnected through intricate family, village, and church networks. Everybody knew everybody. Everyone knew hundreds of poems by heart, as we called it, and could recite them with ease at any time well into old age. The locus of our much-cherished poetry practice encompassed every aspect of Darp life: barnyard, machine shed, living room, school, community and church halls, wedding parties, funerals, competitive arts festivals, and sermons in all our 3 languages and a wide range of cultural registers. We began poetry performance early in my family, reciting long poems in Hochdeutsch for our maternal Oma Aganitha Zacharias on holidays and her birthdays. We dare not stumble in verse 17. The uncles and tantes were watching. It was a high-stakes competition. The honor of our parents was at stake. We didn't just memorize and recite other people's poems, we also composed them. Even the barely literate uncles in my father's Rosengart family, so clever with their hands in farming and carpentry and wood carving, composed verses on the bare machine shed wall with a flat yellow carpenter's pencil, funny serial ballads gently mocking each other that sometimes took all summer to complete. Here are some of the poems I remember best from my own upbringing in the Darpa. Someone came knocking at my wee small door. Someone came knocking, I'm sure, sure, sure. I listened, I opened, I looked to left and right. But not there was a stirring in the still dark night, only the busy beetle tapping in the wall, only from the forest the screech owl's call, only the cricket whistling while the dewdrops fall, so I know not who came knocking at all, at all, at all. That's the first English language poem I learned in grade 1, in room 1 of the Rhineland Elementary School. Thank you, lovely Miss Rita Clausen, for the exquisite reading, writing, memorizing, reciting assignment. Thank you, Walter de la Mare, for the exquisite poem. But who was the mysterious knocker in the middle of the night at our small doors, serenaded by invisible singing creatures of the wild? We knew, of course, about that other knocker on our wooden heart doors from Sunday school, the bearded, white-robed, sandaled, heavenly Jesus with his lantern and shepherd's crook, urgently insisting we let him in, to be inducted into goodness and God's love, most often interpreted as abject obedience to patriarchy and the church. This story, this picture was different. There was the knock, the call, of something untamed, something mysterious, small, open-ended. There were the delicious voices of the night creatures. There were the pleasurable sounds of the words aimed directly at our quantum-dreaming children's hearts, awakening an unseen, achy longing in us, an invitation, a promise we might have to follow without knowing where it led, maybe for the rest of our lives. In fact, we were well acquainted with all kinds of poetry by the time we were sent to school for grade 1. Barefoot, brown-skinned, filled with memories of tree climbing and snow sledding, shouting joyfully across the snow in winter, juicy red raspberries from the garden staining our chins in the summer, not a word of English in us. Our earliest poetic experiences were embodied language games played by our mamas and tantes and omas, with the youngest Chinga. I've brought along one of my grandchildren to demonstrate one of them to you. Well, in proxy. Pretend I'm sitting in a wheelchair, rocking chair. So, some of you may know this rhyme as well. Shuckle, shuckle, shya, Oosternight vaaia, Pinksternight verbutterbraut, Storve nicht, dann worden we groot. Storve dag, dan komen we am Loch. If we don't die, we get to grow up. If we do die, we end up in the hole upside down. My mother didn't like the gruesome, matter-of-fact approach of this rhyme, this unsentimental infant teaching about the basic facts of life and death, even though it always came with a big hug and happy laughter at the end, the relief and joy of having made it back into loving arms for now. So in our house, we sang it like this, mixing up the grimly medieval Gothic and cheerfully superficial modern in the way that we were all adept at in the villages. Shuckle, shuckle, shya, Oostern ate for aya, Pinkston ate for butterbraut, my cheese whiz. There were also fun rhymes with actions attached. Please join me if you remember this one, about the mountain climbing adventures of leprechaun and dwarf, with clever bedtime seductions woven in for the wide-eyed children. Himpelchen und Pimpelchen stiegen auf einen Berg. Himpelchen war ein Heinzelmännchen und Pimpelchen war ein Zwerg. Dort oben blieben sie lange sitzen und wackelten mit ihren Zipfelmützen. Doch endlich, nach 7 langen Wochen, sind sie in den Berg gekrochen. Dort schlafen sie in süßer Ruhe. Ihr lieben Kinder, hört mal zu. We had an extra half hour of instruction at the end of the school day, from grade 1 onward, for supplementary lessons in German language, Bible, and Mennonite catechism, with questions and answers about the nature of the universe and our place in it firmly supplied. Wer machte Himmel und Erde? Gott machte Himmel und Erde. We much preferred the close-up, funky little barnyard ditties of the German language class, like this affectionate little old eco-rhyme. Mu, 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 so ruft im Stall die Kuh. Wir geben ihr das Futter, sie gibt uns Milch und Butter. Mu, 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 so ruft im Stall die Kuh. A marvelous mimeographed collection of classical Deutsche Gedichte appeared on our little school desks in grade 5. The whole course consisted of memorizing, reciting, and writing them out, learning them, as we said, by heart. Most of the Darpchinger hated this course, especially the farm boys, who wanted nothing more than rudimentary arithmetic to sully their sweaty, prepubescent farm boy minds. Perhaps they were afraid of them, these flimsy, sublime poetic creations, the eerie, otherworldly visions of Goethe, Heine, and Schiller, appearing magically on our desks, one after the other. The course was abandoned after its pilot year because of all their complaints, but not before the poems flew straight into my heart and mind and soul, where they are rooted and flowering still. The most haunting and frightening by far was Goethe's dramatic ballad Erlkönig. Wer reitet so spät durch Nacht und Wind, es ist der Vater mit seinem Kind. Hat den Knaben wohl in den Arm, fasst ihn sicher, hält ihn warm. Mein Sohn, was birgst du so bang dein Gesicht? Siehst, Vater, du den Erlkönig nicht, den Erlenkönig mit Kron und Schweif? Mein Sohn, es ist ein Nebelstreif. Mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an. Erlkönig hat mir ein Leid getan. Our classrooms in the DARPA were multi-grade. Our lovely Room 2 teacher that year, Miss Valentine Thiessen, spent much of her time with the grade 8s across the room, eloquently teaching them A Midsummer Night's Dream and Julius Caesar and Jean Valjean. We were welcome to listen in if we'd finished our own lessons, which I very often did. Beware the Ides of March, et tu, Brute. She can perhaps be excused for not thinking to discuss the Deutsche Gedichte with the grade 5s. What was there to discuss anyway, really? We didn't regard poetry then as something to be explained or translated into ordinary flat prose. It was there to be mainlined into our hearts and blood, to sing there and be cherished our whole lives long. Still, I desperately wanted to know, why were they riding through the forest in the middle of the night? Why didn't the father believe his son when he told him the fairy king was grabbing at him? Why did the fairy king want to hurt him? Where were they going, and why wasn't the father able to better protect his child against the terrors of the night? There was no one to ask. Dem Vater grauset's, reitet geschwind, hält in den Armen das ächzende Kind. Reicht den Hof mit Mühe und Not in seinen Armen. Das Kind war tot. That clanging death knell flew straight into my heart. It is clanging in me now. Ode to a sugar beet. O thou sweet sugar beet, how canst thou be eternally in front of me when with my hoe, row after row, I hack thee off? That's a poem I composed while hoeing my father's sugar beet fields in the summer after grade 12, just before I mercifully escaped to the big city to attend university thanks to Canada's generous student loan program. Phew. The poem was a great hit in the DARPA, and my brother sent it off to be included in the 50th anniversary book publication of the Manitoba Sugar Beet Growers Association, which I believe was edited by a woman named Susan Hebert, perhaps the same Susan Hebert already mentioned. It would have been nice if he'd asked me first, It would have been nice if I'd gotten paid to be included so unexpectedly in the public face of the lucrative new sugar beet business, instead of only ever toiling for pennies in the back fields. But we didn't understand modern copyright yet, or indeed the right of women and girls to have and manage our own money, much as we longed for it. Women's and men's labor was still extensively collaborative and strictly divided into time-honored spheres, and poetry was still very much a communalist, improvisational oral practice for us then. Questions. I have 3 questions. Number 1, why did that rich, ancient, much-loved poetry tradition disappear so quickly in the DARPA and churches and urban Mennonite studies programs in Manitoba, even with the encroachment of modernity? After all, poetry has survived quite well in the contemporary world elsewhere. Hope you will help me answer these questions after. Number 2. The repertoire of poetry we were taught in the DARPA, as you can see even from this briefest of surveys, was mostly rooted in the old pagan folk traditions of Northern Europe, nurtured by the earthly realities of our daily peasant lives. Fairies and leprechauns and talking animals abounded, inviting us to play in multiple dimensions of reality, quite apart from anything biblical or Christian or patriarchal or Anabaptist or Canadian. The churches, when I was growing up, were strictly controlled by the men. Women were not allowed to speak publicly there, ever. They were not allowed to attend business meetings or handle money or vote. They were not allowed to ask questions, ever. They had to keep their heads down and covered in church. In any case, they were preoccupied with keeping the children quiet through the long service and worrying about the chicken dinner slow roasting in the oven at home. Their lives were strictly circumscribed. They called themselves by their husbands' names when they met each other in the village or town, even in their own sewing circles. Mrs. Henry Falk, Mrs. Peter P. Zacharias. But they ruled in the home and in the large farmyards. They birthed and raised the children, they milked the cows, they fed the chickens, they grew the vegetables, they sewed the clothes and washed and ironed them, they baked the bread and pies and cakes, they churned the butter, they cooked and canned and served the jellies and pickles and jams, they stoked the coal furnace, they embroidered the pillowcases made from old bleached cotton flour sacks. While they performed these endless rounds of highly skilled tasks, they sang the old songs and told us the old stories. They showed us where the fairies lived in the purple iris flower garden next to the evergreens. They put out imaginary treats for the little people who might come in the night to help shine up the family's shoes lined up at the door in readiness for Sunday morning. They sent us sweetly, gently into the night with magic silver fish gliding through silver streams under the silver moon, sailing serenely above us in the night sky in her silver shoon. Why has this more whimsical, poetic, flowery, fairy-studded gold and silver dream world of our heritage not been remembered and celebrated more? This was the vital cultural repertoire of those often maligned, backward, what was that again? Poor and simple, Poetics-speaking peasant Mennonites who cherished the old ways, the old songs, the old languages, as did, obviously, the German and English Romantic poets of the 19th century who came into our lives through the schools. We tried so hard in the DARPA to keep these old treasures, this vibrant traditionalist Darp poetics, alive against the changing times of our era. Mostly unsuccessfully, it seems, at least in Manitoba, though some of us have been extensively recognized and celebrated for it in our own literary writing elsewhere. And a little bit here as well. Number 3, I knew from a very young age I would be a poet for my whole life. Our lives from early childhood onward were saturated with music and poetry. Everyone wanted me to become a poet. I was groomed to become one from a young age. But then everyone I knew growing up was also a poet. Everyone in the traditionalist Southern Manitoba DARPA, except prepubescent schoolboys, loved poetry of all kinds, reverent, irreverent, satirical, deep, silly, funny, outrageous, sacrilegious, tragic, devotional, naughty, sublime. in several languages and a wide array of emotional registers, by heart. If someone had told us that someday the Mennonite churches and university programs of Manitoba would vilify me and others for trying to bring that traditionalist, multidimensional, untamed poetics into contemporary English public discourse, we would not have believed it. Whatever happened to all that?
Oh, wow. That was not my back. Speaking of ruptures, church with 250 members splits into 250 churches. I set this in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, only for variety's sake, but you can just replace that with Steinbach or Winkler or whatever you please. After a particularly heated membership meeting this past week, the South Lancaster Mennonite Church has decided to split the entire congregation into more manageable units of one. At first, we decided to just split into two groups, those in favor of buttons on their shirts and those who preferred hooks, explained Daniel B. Miller, former South Lancaster elder and recently appointed pastor of Daniel B. Miller Memorial Church. But then the button users started talking amongst themselves and found they had differences of opinion on baptismal water temperature. Those wanting hot and those wanting cold split into their own groups. So then we had the pro-button, pro-cold, pro-button, anti-cold, anti-button, pro-cold, and anti-button, anti-cold groups. I figured it was all settled, but on further discussion, the groups realized they couldn't agree on whether to sing 5 or 6 hymns each Sunday. And so there was an anti-button, anti-cold, pro-5 group, and an anti-button, anti-cold, pro-6 group, and a pro-button, anti-cold. Well, you get the idea. The groups just kept getting smaller and smaller. Eventually, we all decided to each form our own churches, but there was some opposition to that idea too. The once thriving South Lancaster Church is now 253 to be precise, individual churches, although the division continues. The whole starting your own church thing has got me studying theology, explained Miller, and now I change church doctrine every day. I don't even agree with myself anymore. Miller says he's excommunicated his past self for differences on clerical celibacy, but is concerned that a future version of himself might disagree. Who knows what I might believe this Friday afternoon, explained Miller. I always get a little too liberal when the weekend approaches. I write satire about Mennonites, and when I was told this opening Ruptures and forging connections was going to be the title that we were given for this panel, I thought, what would I say about that? And then I thought, well, actually, what is satire if not doing both of these things? And then I thought, actually, it isn't just satire that opens ruptures and forges connections, but all art or writing, and I'll even say history, also potentially opens ruptures or forges connections. That's depending, I suppose, on the audience's responses to what you're writing. For example, I received this email recently. I posted this on social media. If you follow me on there, you might have seen this, that I posted this. But this is a real email I received recently. You are not funny. You make Mennonites look incredibly stupid, and you should be ashamed of yourself. I'm proud to be a Mennonite. I'm horrified every time I see some of your writing. I do get emails like this once in a while. When I posted this recently on social media, there was hundreds of comments in reply affirming what I do. So I realized that this is probably a minority opinion, but nevertheless, it is an opinion that is out there. But when I look at this email, or the ideas that are contained in it, it represents a lot of things that people have said about Mennonite writers or artists in the past. The idea that somehow the artist or writer is supposed to sort of protect a certain image of what Mennonites are, and you shouldn't make them look bad and so on. But that's not what a writer or artist is. I don't think writers or artists are trying to make anyone look bad or stupid. They are just portraying things as they are. I like what Armin says, but that you're not a public relations. You're not doing public relations. And then this comment here, I'm proud to be a Mennonite. Now, proud, of course, amongst Mennonites is a, contentious word. But anyone but they're saying this as if somehow suggesting I am somehow ashamed to be Mennonite. Anyone that knows me knows that that's definitely not something I hide from or am ashamed of or anything like that. So there's a lot of assumptions in here, I think perhaps misguided assumptions about what is satire or art or writing or what should or shouldn't be said and so on. So in The Best of the Bonnet, there's an afterword there where I say satire by its very nature is critical. And here I was thinking, critical as in offering a critique, but maybe it could also mean important. But here I meant offering a critique. Satire by its very nature is critical, but I think the Daily Bonnet, which is now called the Unger Review, is as much a celebration of Mennonite quirks as it is a critique. It's both. It forges connections and creates ruptures, and sometimes simultaneously the exact same article will get that reaction of, how dare you say such a thing, and another person thinking, this is the funniest thing you've ever written. And if I just go based on audience responses, I would, you'd be sort of paralyzed in inability to write anything if you're just basing it on trying to please an audience. Another article there, I'll just read the headline. Mennonite town installs massive new rug under which to sweep all their problems. And that's an AI, the image there is an AI-generated image. I told, what's that thing, that AI thing that makes images? I said, this is what I came up with when I said, make a very, very large quilt or whatever, and 2 Mennonite women standing in front of it. That's what I came up with. So, it did a pretty good job. Because there's no way I could come up with, an actual photo that looked like that, with a carpet so large. But I think that what satirists, writers, artists, and historians all do is look under the rug and uncover those things. So I've always thought that the literary writers and the historians should be united in that sense. And my novel, Once Removed, which I'll talk a little bit more about because I think it'll be of interest, because this is a history conference and it's really stems from my interest in history and literature, and how I saw those two groups of people as sort of united, or they should be anyways, united in the sense that they're both telling stories, maybe of a different variety and of a different genre and style, but both the literary writer and the artist and the historian are telling stories. Sometimes stories that people don't want to be told, but nevertheless, it's their job to tell stories. And in Once Removed, it's the plot is these people in a small Mennonite town who are trying to preserve historic buildings while there's very aggressive opposition to this, and very people that are wanting to destroy the historic buildings and silence the storytellers, both. And so in my head, I was thinking, the people that are interested in history are the same people that are interested in literature, pitted against the people who want to destroy history and silence stories. That was, what I was thinking in this. And partly this was inspired by some real life experiences that I've had, including attending this conference, but just some experiences in the last few years leading up to the book being published. This is a very famous photo here of an auto dealer in Steinbach. I'm from Steinbach, A.D. Penner. In 1960, he later became mayor, but at this point he was an auto dealer. In 1960, and here he is bulldozing. You can see in the background, I'm sure some of you have seen this photo before, the last house barn in Steinbach is being bulldozed there, and his mother is spanking him. Now, this is like a staged photo, and it's supposed to be funny, I guess, as if to say, like, almost like who, like if you look at this photo, like who is the subject of the humor? Who is being mocked here? It's actually the mother. It's the mother, right? Because look at the smile. You're supposed to think with this photo, maybe I'm overthinking it, but you're supposed to think, how ridiculous it would be for her to scold him for destroying this building. That's, I think, the message that this photo is supposed to send. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Once Removed has a lot to do with preservation of house barns, which I'll read in just a second. And one review of the book said, well, there actually aren't a lot of people living in there aren't any, I think the review said, people living in house barns in southern Manitoba. And I'm like, that's not true. That's definitely not true. It's true in the East Reserve, but in the West Reserve, I don't know, there's several dozen at least, maybe more, people still now living in house barns. And I imagine that the people that live in those places are doing it because they want to preserve this tradition and have an interest in history and preservation and so on. So that was one inspiration. Okay, well, I wanted to talk about the title, even just unpacking the title. The obvious, meaning of the title is like, once removed in terms of people being related to each other. So if your cousin's child or is your first cousin once removed, that genealogical sort of thing. So there is that meaning to the title. This is a photo of Bison Books. Did you know that they had such a good collection of these family history books? And there's even a Stace genealogy there. What's that? Oh, is he? Oh, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure he probably wrote it. So there's once removed, there's that meaning of once removed. But there's also, as in the previous photo, of once a building, for example, is removed, what stories have we lost when these buildings are removed to be replaced with a used car lot? Once removed also can mean once we remove something, we can unveil beauty. So it's not only sort of the censorious sense of the word of removing something to destroy something, but also removing something to unveil beauty. So the cover of the novel has a section of a floor pattern that was uncovered by Marguerite Cron, and I'm sure you're familiar with her work restoring and uncovering these floor patterns, often having to remove many, many layers of linoleum and carpet and who knows what to get at this beauty that has been hidden. So that's also what I was thinking when I thought of the title. Aaron and I have also, partly, this is when we first discovered Ernie Braun and Glenn Clausen's Atlas of the East Reserve, and they actually took us to, I think this is Shanzai, is that correct? In the East Reserve, there's very few historic buildings left. There are 0 house barns, except at the museum, but there are some foundations of house barns. And so this is, in a farmer's field, you have to get permission to go here, but in amongst the dairy cows, there's almost like an archaeological site here of the remains of what once was a village where there were people who had stories and all this sort of thing. So that's another thing I was thinking about when I thought of the title. So I'm just going to read you a little bit. I'm not actually going to read the quote that's up there on the screen, but I'm just going to read you a little bit from Once Removed. This scene is where the characters are going to a preservation society meeting in this small Mennonite town. Okay. I sat between Mrs. Friesen and Mrs. Entz while Katie wedged herself between Mr. Wiebe and Brenda, the only other active member under 50 who, due to her position at the local credit union, is more commonly referred to by locals as that Brenda from the loans department. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of Anabaptist heroes from centuries ago, which is entrenched in her memory and plastered all over her body in the form of tattoos. Good, said Mr. Wiebe. Looks like we've reached quorum. I counted. There were 6 of us. Mr. Wiebe stood up and pulled the cap off a thick black marker, the scent of which immediately had me feeling a bit woozy. I assume you've all brought your pamphlets with you. We had. Katie poked around in her purse, then reached across the table and handed it to me. A historic walking tour of Edenfeld. It had a map and a description of all the heritage sites in the area. Mrs. Friesen put it together one summer in the 1980s before BLT Wientz was mayor, and it's been photocopied and re-photocopied to the point where it's almost completely illegible. Skipping ahead a little bit here. Time for the annual revision, he said, holding up the pamphlet. He unfolded it, revealing the map on the inside, and put a big black X through the Lepp barn, the Rempel store, and a few other places that had met their demise in the last year, and then held it up for us to follow his example. He passed around the marker. Please update your maps, he said, if you haven't already done so. Mr. Wiebe is a retired science teacher, but his real passion is local architecture. He spent many a summer working on a book about our building practices called Longing for House Barns, Blueprints and Poems. The humble house barn, Mr. Wiebe says, as we inhaled black marker fumes and updated our maps, more than any other example of Mennonite architecture, represents our pragmatism, our work ethic, and our connection to the land. I can think of no more vital representation of our heritage. He said these buildings were something we should be proud of, though there was some debate about whether we should be proud of our house barns or simply appreciative, until Katie said the difference was merely semantics and perhaps we were getting sidetracked. Regardless, we have to save the ones we have, said Mr. Wiebe. The one we have, you mean, Mrs. Friesen reminded him. Skipping ahead here a little bit. Mr. Wiebe said the plaque outside the Hebert House Barn could also use an update. Maybe it could be modified to include some information about the original owners, the Klippensteins. He said he was willing to write the text if Katie and I would give it a proofread, a task which everyone affirmed by a show of hands. None of us wanted to repeat the fiasco they recently had over in Neu-Kronsberg, where they spent $2,000 on a huge commemorative cairn honoring the town's pioneers, only to find it had been autocorrected to Nude Kronsberg. An error that disappointed dozens of frat boys who drove in from the city one weekend to find nothing but a dull prairie town and its fully clothed inhabitants. There are dozens of these plaques all over town installed during Edenfeld's centennial celebrations in 1976. There is one in front of each of our 5 churches, some businesses, a couple trees, a few private residences, and even next to the Heritage Boot Scraper out on the road, on the highway that contains the petrified boot scrapings of an early Edenfeld pioneer and world-famous cheesemaker Johann B. Peters. That's what the sign says anyways. This is all before BLT became mayor. Not a single plaque has been put up since. But I know a lot of people say, oh, I'm run out of time, quick. A lot of people say that this book is about Steinbeck, and I deliberately included things like, I say the centennial is 1976, which of course would make not Steinbeck, right? I deliberately conflate these things to make it sure that this is fiction, right? But we did put up a plaque for Miriam Taves in the last few months, so we're trying to make sure that we do have this continued history and literary, coming together kind of thing. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to each of our 4 presenters for a wonderful wrap-up to the conference. We have plenty of time. So we have a couple of microphones. I think one is making its way upstairs right now. I see a couple of hands already. So one here and a couple other hands somewhere. I can go upstairs. This one's going upstairs.
Within the hallowed halls of the University of Winnipeg, Professor Harry Lone in the early 80s used to say to the students there taking his history courses, we won't have matured as a people until we can talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. He said the only people right now who are writing about that are our fiction writers. And he says, once we are able to get away from the boosterism of the first MP, the first judge, and so on, we'll know that we're on our path to become mature as a people. And I think those words are shown here. So, and it's good to see at times that the fiction side and the history side and the crossover, I think, is very dramatic. Thank you.
And poetry.
Maybe my comment is a little bit going in a different direction. I'm thinking of Arnold Dick, who wrote satire about Mennonites, and he wrote poetry, and he combined history and literature. And he also wrote plays. So do you, Di or Armin or Andy, do you see yourselves in any continuity to Arnold Dick, who was earlier cited in a previous session in a less, kind of a shadow side, and or others of you in the room who maybe recall Arnold Dick? Is there a continuity between Arnold Dick and our modern writers?
Well, I heard of Arnold Dick a little bit when I was growing up. I think I saw an Arnold Dick play in a school in Rhineland when I was a kid. I think it was De Fria, which is a popular one that's been done over the years quite a lot. Other than that, I mean, I heard people talked about Kopenbue, and I think Henry Entz used to read Kopenbue on CFAM. But in terms of did his writing influence me, no, I didn't read him in Poetics. I mean, I tried, but it was in Gothic script, and I'd lost that skill by that time. I did read in A Sack Full of Poetics, that anthology of Low German stories. There are a couple of sketches by him, and I translated one for a conference one time, and he poked at some serious issues. I mean, there's a sketch about a bunch of Tyrrells talking about the Selbstschutz in Russia, and the Canadians are trying to understand what happened there, and the Russlander are saying, well, we just shot in the air. It wasn't our fault that the enemy walked in front of the bullets, you know. I mean, so we're pretty gentle compared to him, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, we listened to Kopenbue on the radio in my home and laughed our heads off. And the thing that I remember is he goes on a walking journey. The character goes on a walking journey, and he only has one sausage along to eat on this long journey. So he rations himself, and he says, "Jede Dusenschritt ein Hops." One bite every 1,000 steps. And then he drops the skin of the sausage. And then on his way back, he doesn't have any sausage, so he eats the skin every 1,000 steps. He finds the old skin and eats that. But yeah, absolutely. He's part of that heritage as well. Also, Aunt Ollie on a CFM radio. We listen very faithfully to her, the many beautiful stories she presented for children on the radio, and so absolutely, like my, I guess the point I was trying to make in my presentation is the creative arts were like absolutely central to the cultural expression in the DARPA, and I mean, it's just unthinkable, really, that they would have become somehow forbidden later. It doesn't make sense. Now, we did separate them out in the different languages. So, because we had Plattdeutsch and Hochdeutsch in English, we were able to sort of regulate. We had very strict rules about it. You're not allowed to speak the wrong language in the wrong place. So, and that included social codes. So I suppose that was the big transgression, is that we mixed the codes together instead of keeping them separate. So, I mean, that's a transgression, but I feel like this is sort of this current sort of the Canadian Mennonites, like in the churches and even in the colleges, like this kind of, that there's been an incredible impoverishment, narrative impoverishment, by trying to somehow marginalize the literary, or set us aside, or punish us, as some of us have been extensively, and shunned and stuff, and vilified. So why? It actually doesn't make sense, and I think it should stop. I think you should all help make it stop. And I asked the CMU people one time when I was there, it's my alma mater, Peter's also, I was encouraged to become a professional writer there. And asked them, why are they not teaching the new Mennonite writing? And some of the professors said, because they're scared to. Why are they scared to? Why are they scared to teach it now? And I said, they've been remiss in not teaching the Manitoba Mennonites their own literature. So, my experience with going to visit some church people is like, we can watch Pink Panther movies and laugh at all the violent bits, but we cannot talk about questions asked my mother ever, because it's so sacrilegious. So it doesn't make sense to me that we would have tried to skip over the literary and actually just impoverished ourselves culturally. And anyway, we're not dead, we're alive. The thing is still alive, We would like more a welcome from the church related Mennonites.
So I'll just add that. So I work on literary criticism, and I spend quite a bit of time thinking about Mennonite literature. And we can think of that influence of someone like Dick in literal terms, so we're listening to them on the radio, seeing the plays, and so on. But there's also ways in which we can kind of map those sorts of continuum as expressions of Mennonite Lower German culture. And so some scholars have talked about speaking through the flower, this sort of deadpan literalism that comes from Plout Beach kind of worldviews as being traceable across various writers. So I think you can see that in Armin's work, absolutely. You can see that in the work of the satires of Andrew and so on. And I think kind of the paradigmatic example would be Dick's work. So I'd say absolutely. I know there's a question up top, and then another one here.
I have two quick comments. First of all, I sang Shako Shako Shaya to my kids, so I'm still trying. I also wanted to say to Armin, Yash and Ota have lived in my heart for a long, long time. They gave me an incredible gift. When the book first came out, I was living next door to my grandparents, who were extremely interested in the book and even more excited about it when they heard that it was being banned in certain places. So I gave them a copy. My grandmother read it. I went to see her and I said, "So, what did you think?" And she was really quiet for a while, and I thought, uh-oh. And then she said, "I'm just so relieved somebody's finally telling the truth." And that opened up a whole set of conversations for us about the pieces of her life, the sexuality of people within the communities. And the Yash and Ota got pregnant before they were married. And it just opened up all these beautiful stories that she shared with me. And it opened up a whole new part of our relationship that kept going after that book. I got to know her as a young woman in love, living, these more, her favorite line was always, we used to have to sit around at baby showers with 9-pound babies who had been born, and everyone kept saying how wonderful it was that they'd been born 3 months premature. Wasn't it a miracle from God? And she said, and we all sat there and we lied to each other, and we knew we were lying to each other. But it just opened up a whole new beautiful part of who she was as a person and the culture that she grew up with. So I will love Yash and Ota forever. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
Here and then there. Oh, over there again.
So, Andrew, to link, you had mentioned the, over here, Andrew, yep.
Oh, okay, there.
Perfect. You had mentioned the link between historians and creators of art. So a question for the panel. If you read, there's an old history book, The Mennonite Brotherhood in Russia, written by one P.M. Friesen. And if you know him, you know him, because he says something like about the, so he stayed in Russia, and he writes things like, in about 1912, thank God those immigrants left. They had a complete aversion to culture. He didn't have many kind words to say about those departing Mennonites who had left in the 1870s. So again, I think the quote is a complete aversion to culture. And now here we are in a panel about cultural production among 1870s descendants. So just curious for the entire panel if you have any comments to make about culture in your upbringing and what it means to you four as 1870s descendants. And a quick bonus question for Andrew. Do you think it would be fair to say that angry email, maybe he belongs in the anti-rupture, pro-connection division of the church?
Yeah, that's the new schism. I'm starting that one. We have a Saturday evening service.
I'm gonna make a wild guess about how could this have happened that the churches, like I've been reading the Canadian Mennonite newspaper, and it's like, should we accept culture as like something we can take part in and like, or do we have to reject it altogether? This is just a very bizarre discussion for me, and I'm gonna take a wild guess about where this has come from. I think that the keepers of culture, and at least in the DARPA, was the women. Like why I think it has something to do with gender and misogyny and trying. We were literally shut out of every single thing to do with church organization of any kind. So but we had our own separate sphere, and we had a very lively and fun and lovely culture, women's culture. And I don't know why is that being thrown away now as women are entering the public sphere more, so or being denigrated. So, and then you hear people say things like, is it Kampfsport or is it, Jesus Christ? And it's like, but faith versus culture is like, don't we live in our bodies on this earth? Isn't it how we live in our bodies on this earth the whole thing, the whole thing of it?
I see 3 more questions at least. I'm going to jump in just for a moment and ask Miriam, invite you to respond to this question of relationship between history and art, because it seems to me that your work is doing this in a really intentional way that might be a little bit different than some of the other panelists on here. So can you speak to that relationship?
Yes, I work in 2 different streams of art, so to speak. One that is a lot more academic that I started during my master's, which is very heavily research based, so I almost use my visual image making like a research paper. And then I have a different stream that is less heavy, more based on personal experience, more autobiographical, still related to the map making. But I've always been really fascinated by the Mennonite history, which is part of my history, but my dad was a Catholic from Germany, and he was extremely fascinated by Mennonite history, and I think he researched more and knew more about Mennonite history than most of the locals in Paraguay, so I think I got his interest in the history and in that, in the connections of all the migrations, and then me somehow ending up back here in Manitoba, kind of completing some kind of family circle on my mother's side. It's just, I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's evident that relationship between your scholarly work and the art here, I think, comes out really clearly. Next question, please.
Hey, Armin, I reread your Salvation of Josh Siemens recently, and I enjoyed it just as much as the first time, and I really love your characters. And I'm wondering, do you have a favorite character that you've created, and how did that one come to be?
Well, I guess it would have to be Ota because she won't leave me alone. And how she came to be, I mean, I was writing Yash, and I was inside Yash's head with his Scheif point of view and all that. And she crops up and he's making fun of her and so on. So come and see the recipe. Because Yash isn't in charge anymore of the story. Okay.
Excellent. There's a question up top. And then next to you. Thank you.
I have a question for Miriam. I was fascinated by your art, and so beautiful and so extensive in your research, etc., especially with the idea of reconciliation now and ethnic groups. And so I'm wondering, how did it change you to work on these beautiful prints that you've put out?
Thank you for that question. Yes, very much so. All the research that I do for my own personal learning journey. So as an artist, I always make my work first and foremost for myself, and then I'm happy to share it with the world and hopefully inspire others with the stories that I share. Again, my research journey that is a bit more critical of Mennonite history started in graduate school, and that's the first time when I came across first-person accounts by indigenous elders that shared their experience of colonization in the Paraguayan Chaco. And those were, for me, real eye-openers and aha moments that changed the view of my whole existence and the experience of my life I had until then. So yeah, that was really, really profound, and I became curious to learn more about it. So that has very much powered the research I have done into the connections between Mennonite settlers and indigenous inhabitants of the lands where the Mennonites settled. And, I just lost my train of thought there for a moment. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
I can't hear you, no, sorry.
I don't think I've ever seen anything like it, so I'm curious because it's unique, and so you must have struggled and come up with that. But your answer is fine. It's okay. I'm happy.
I do know now what I wanted to say. What has really, really encouraged me to look further into the reconciliation processes are the conversations that are happening here in Canada, which really give me hope that there can be a different way of thinking about it too. And I do feel that the communities in Paraguay are still several years behind in these conversations. They're not really part of mainstream yet, and I would really like to see some of the mainstream settler views change to a more reconciliatory tone.
So I saw you had your hand up, and thank you, Jeremy. And then I saw another hand over here somewhere in the back.
What? If you'll allow me, my name is Walter Sawatsky, in case you've ever placed me anywhere. I want to thank you, if I may, for having the opportunity to attend here at this event, at least part of it. It just happened to come in with some family visits. And I've appreciated much of what I've heard. My mind went back to when we celebrated the centenary of what nowadays we are still calling the Kanaja Mennonites. And there too, I happened to be back from a couple of years of traveling across the Soviet Union and getting acquainted there. And so we celebrated this event in around 1973, 74, I don't remember exactly. And I was to give a presentation, and Gerhard Lawrence introduced me. And what he said was, he knows a lot of our people far more than you do, even if he is not von Unser, which meant I was the Canadier and he was the Russlander. Two papers that I delivered were published, and what they were about was so many of our people, if you name everybody who wants to use that word Mennonite or even Anabaptist, we didn't know where they were. So the questions constantly were, do you know where they are? And so I told them of some of them that I'd heard about, and so there was always a map on both of those two papers, one in Mennonite Life and the other one in Mennonite Quarterly Review. And that has gone on forever and a day. This feels like my phone, sorry.
Do we have a question for the panelists?
There. One of the themes that Gerhard then had, and he was getting a little older, you know, and I think we were also giving him a festschrift around that time. There were about a dozen of us people who wrote on that one. But he was not really expecting a gathering of Mennonites 100 years from now. And part of my thinking here was, most of the pictures I see in the magazines, I lived in USA over 40 years and other places too. So most of them are not as white as my face. And I really didn't see any dark faces here either. That's kind of strange. What is it to be a Mennonite and why? Is a question I'm coming from here, and what are the descriptors worth using for it? But I thank you.
Thank you very much. The question of what does it mean to be a Mennonite and why, maybe we won't answer that in full today, but does anybody want to take a shot at that?
Isn't everything we've been saying about that?
It's a big question.
Yeah. We maybe have room for one last question, and then we'll wrap it up all the way in the back. Yep, that's right.
Hi. I am a lover of books and a lover of art. I'm an artist myself, well, quasi. But I just wanted to let you know, I wasn't sure if you were all aware, but Miriam has just released a new book. It's called Layered Histories, Perspectives on Colonization from the Chaco. And if you were fascinated by her work, the layering, there's a book chock full of it right here. Also, before you were talking about Mennonites in photography. I have one copy left of the Mennonite photography. It is fascinating. I have books from the other authors as well. So if you feel like treating yourself and indulging at home, you know where I am. Thank you so much for sharing your particular art form. Thanks.
Excellent. Maybe we'll have one last. Yep. Oh, I managed to miss it. Thanks, Roy.
I have two comments. And the first one is to Miriam. We talk about the importance of stories, and I own your McDermott 1, 2, and 3. I tell your story every time I talk about those pictures, because you were a youth artist. I point out the X you put in your window, where this is where she painted as a student. I talk about how in each one, you put yourself in each one of those pictures of the three, the triptych that I have. And so the story that you told me, I continue to tell your story, because it's important to me that I talk about you as the artist, and people always look at this in front of my dining room table. There are three huge pictures, And I still want to say thank you for creating those for my house. And so storytelling works. And when I was working at the MCC store yesterday, at the thrift store, the furniture one, and I had to speak. I was speaking with my Ukrainian coworkers, and of course they've got all these traumas about being not in their homes anymore either. And I say to them, tell your children about your stories. We talked about it yesterday again. The stories that you have as you're coming here. So I think that the things that you've talked about and the stories that you tell are all those ways. And
Excellent.
one last thing to Mr. Unger. One of the original houses that was on Main Street, that was the butcher shop on Steinbach, was just raised this week, like this month, this summer. The house that was 3 doors from my mother's house on Hanover Street, the original butcher shop, it was torn down because history did not hold that building close. And I told lots of people about that building.
Yeah.
Look at that building. The Miss Nichols, 2 single nickel women, lived in that house, but it was the butcher shop, original. Nobody looked at that house. Makes me crazy.
I could say one. Yeah, that's definitely a theme in Steinbach and probably some other communities in southern Manitoba. Supposedly these towns, cities now are from 1874, but good luck finding a building older than 1982 or so. Yeah, there's no respect for that.
And there was no aluminum siding on it.
And so we are thankful for the stories being told that are they're bringing back some of this history or telling our new stories here. That's going to bring our panel to a close. Thank you for your questions and your attention. Please help me thank them one more time.